It's 2:14 in the morning, and a man in a gray zip-up jacket and scrub pants is walking fast down a hospital corridor, badge clipped low on his hip, where nobody can quite read it, eyes fixed on a room number at the far end of the hall. A nurse steps out from behind her station and plants herself directly in his path. "Sir, you can't be back here. This is a restricted wing. I need to see this patient. I need you to leave the way you came in, or I'm calling security." He doesn't leave. He takes one more step toward the door, and that's when she presses the little black button clipped to her lanyard, and somewhere down at the front desk, a light starts blinking red. For minutes later, two security guards would have his arms behind his back in a hallway outside a 10-year-old girl's hospital room, while a monitor beeped softly through the wall behind him. 12 minutes after that, the chief of medicine himself would come running down that same hallway in his pajama pants and an unzipped coat, take one look at the man pinned against the wall, and say four words that would end this nurse's shift, her week, and very nearly her career. "Dr. Whitfield, are you okay?" Because the man they had just dragged out of a dying child's room, the man a nurse had decided was a threat before she ever asked his name, was the surgeon who had operated on that same girl 12 hours earlier. And he was the only person in that entire hospital who could save her a second time. Have you ever watched someone decide who you are before you've said a single word? Stay with me, because in 19 minutes, that decision was going to cost more than anyone in that hallway understood. His name is Marcus Whitfield. He is 46 years old, and he has spent 21 of those years inside the walls of Ridgeview Memorial, the same hospital where 38 years ago, his mother used to push a cleaning cart down these exact hallways after the sun went down. Her name was Odessa Whitfield, and she worked the overnight shift here for 11 years, mopping the same tile floors her son now crosses in loafers with a stethoscope around his neck, because somebody has to keep a hospital clean while the rest of the world sleeps, and nobody thanked her for it. Not once, not in 11 years. Marcus remembers her coming home at dawn smelling like bleach and hospital soap, easing her shoes off at the door because her feet had swollen through another 12-hour shift, and telling him every single morning without fail that this building was where miracles happened, and that one day, baby, you're going to walk those halls, and it's going to be because you belong there, not because somebody handed you a mop. He was 8 years old the first time he told her he wanted to be a doctor. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell him it was a long shot for a boy from their side of town, with a single mother in a school district that had given up on itself years before he was born. She just nodded and said, "Then we start now," and she meant it, because from that day forward, every extra shift she picked up, every double she took on holiday, when the pay was better, went into a coffee can on top of the refrigerator with his name written on masking tape across the lid. He got into medical school on a scholarship he studied for in the break room of this exact hospital, at the same plastic table where his mother ate her lunch at 3 in the morning, because she couldn't afford a babysitter, and the night shift supervisor let her bring him along on weekends as long as he stayed quiet and did his homework. He remembers the smell of that break room more clearly than he remembers most of his own wedding. Burnt coffee, bleach, his mother's hand on the back of his neck when he got questioned wrong, not scolding him, just steadying him the way you'd steady a table that was starting to wobble. She died 4 years before he finished his surgical residency. Ovarian cancer, caught late, the way it so often is for women who spend their whole lives taking care of everyone except themselves. Marcus was in his 3rd year of training when it happened, and he has never once, not in 17 years since, been able to walk past the oncology wing on the 3rd floor without his chest tightening, just slightly, just enough that only he would ever notice it happen. He came back to Ridgeview Memorial on purpose. He could have taken a position anywhere, Baltimore, Chicago, a research hospital in Boston that offered him triple the salary and half the call hours, but he came back here to the hospital where his mother mopped floors for 11 years and never once got so much as a card on her birthday from the administration, because he wanted this building to remember her whether it wanted to or not. 15 years later, he is the chief of surgery. His name is on a plaque in the lobby. It is also, quietly, on a small brass memorial plate outside the 3rd floor break room, a plate he had installed himself and paid for out of his own pocket, that reads simply, "In memory of Odessa Whitfield, who kept this hospital running long before anyone thought to thank her." Almost nobody who works the day shift knows that story. Almost nobody who works the night shift has ever bothered to ask. That Tuesday night, The reason Marcus Whitfield was walking fast down a restricted corridor at 2 in the morning in a gray zip-up jacket instead of a white coat was a 10-year-old girl named Sophie Hastings. Sophie had come in 18 hours earlier with acute appendicitis that had already ruptured by the time her parents got her through the emergency room doors, and Marcus had spent 4 hours in the operating room that afternoon fighting a spreading infection that had turned what should have been a routine procedure into something considerably more dangerous. He had told her parents, exhausted, still in his surgical cap, that the next 48 hours would tell them everything. He had gone home at 9 that night, showered, eaten half a sandwich standing over his kitchen sink, and fallen asleep in his clothes on top of the covers, phone charging on a nightstand, because that is simply what the first night after a surgery like that looks like for a man who has never learned how to fully leave his patients at the hospital door. At 1:52 in the morning, his phone buzzed with an alert from the hospital's remote monitoring system, a program he had personally pushed the administration to install 2 years earlier, over considerable resistance, specifically so that post-operative complications could be caught in the gap between one nurse's rounds and the next. Sophie's oxygen saturation was dropping. Not catastrophically, not yet, but in a pattern he recognized immediately, the slow, quiet, deceptive kind of decline that kills people precisely because it doesn't announce itself with alarms until it's already a crisis. He didn't call the on-call resident. He didn't wait for a nurse to notice on her next scheduled check. He pulled on the closest clothes he could find, grabbed his badge, and drove 11 minutes through empty streets to get back to a hospital that in 18 years had never once seen him show up looking anything less than exactly like what he was. That was his mistake, if you can even call it that. He looked, that night, like a man in a hurry, not like a chief of surgery. And the nurse standing at the station outside Sophie Hastings' room had started her shift at Ridgeview Memorial exactly 9 days earlier. Her name is Kayla Simmons. She is 26 years old, and it would be easy and it would be lazy to make her into a simple villain in this story. So let's not do that, because the truth about her is more uncomfortable than that and more useful to sit with. Kayla had transferred from a hospital 2 states away after a difficult year. A bad supervisor, a burnout diagnosis, or therapist had gently suggested she take seriously, and she had come to Ridgeview Memorial determined, almost desperately determined, to prove that she could do everything by the book this time, follow every protocol, question every irregularity, be the nurse who never let anything slip through the cracks again. 9 days into a new job, on a restricted post-surgical wing, at 2 in the morning, she saw a man she didn't recognize, dressed in clothes that didn't match hospital staff, moving with urgency toward a critical patient's room, and every piece of her training told her the same thing at once. Unfamiliar person, off hours, no visible badge, restricted access. She did exactly what her orientation manual told her to do. The problem was never that she followed protocol. The problem was the half-second before protocol. The half-second where she looked at a black man in a zip-up jacket moving quickly through a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning and decided, before she had gathered a single additional fact, that the most likely explanation was danger rather than the second, most obvious possibility sitting right there in front of her, that maybe, just maybe, this was someone who worked here. "Sir, you can't be back here. This is a restricted wing." Marcus, exhausted, running on adrenaline and 11 minutes of sleep-deprived driving, did something that, looking back, he would recognize as his second mistake of the night. He didn't stop to explain himself. "I need to see this patient," he said, and kept walking, because in his mind, every second he spent negotiating his own legitimacy was a second Sophie Hastings didn't have. "I need you to leave the way you came in, or I'm calling security." He didn't leave. He took one more step toward the door. She pressed a button on her lanyard. Here is where the story does something most of these stories never bother to do, and it matters, so stay with me. This is not a story where a nurse is cruel or careless or looking for a reason to hurt someone. This is a story about a system that trains people to react to fear faster than it trains them to react to curiosity, and about what happens when that training collides, at 2 in the morning, with a man who has spent his entire adult life proving, over and over, that he belongs in rooms other people assume he doesn't. The 2 security guards who arrived were named Frank Doyle and Reggie Torres, both contracted through a third-party firm, both with less than 6 months on the job, both trained primarily on liability and de-escalation scripts that had almost nothing to say about hospital hierarchy, because nobody at the contracting company had ever imagined a scenario quite like this one. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. I am a physician at this hospital. Check my badge, it's on my belt. Sir, hand where I can see them. Please. There's a patient in that room I need to check on right now. Her oxygen levels are dropping. Every minute matters. Sir, we're not going to ask again." Somewhere behind that door, 20 feet away, close enough that Marcus could hear the soft, rhythmic beep of a monitor through the wall, a 10-year-old girl lay recovering from surgery he himself had performed, her oxygen slowly slipping in exactly the pattern his own monitoring system had been built to catch. And the man capable of catching it in time was being walked backward down a hallway with his arms pinned behind him by two guards who had never once looked at his badge. "Let it," Marcus said, something quiet then, something Kayla would replay in her head for months afterward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight the grip on his arms. He simply said, "Look at the room number. 214. Pull up the chart. My name is on the surgical log from this afternoon. You have 30 seconds before this becomes something none of you can undo." Nobody moved to check. And here is the moment, the exact moment, where this story stops being about a misunderstanding and starts being about something heavier. Because at 2:09 that morning, an on-call resident happened to be walking past with a printout in her hand. A young woman named Dr. Priya Anand, only 4 months in her own residency, and she saw a man in a gray jacket being restrained outside room 214, and something about his face stopped her cold. She had scrubbed in on Sophie Hastings' surgery that afternoon. She knew exactly whose hands those were. "That's Dr. Whitfield." Her voice cracked slightly on the second word, disbelief and horror colliding in real time. "That's the chief of surgery. Let him go. Right now, that's Dr. Whitfield." The hallway went very still. Kayla Simmons, standing at her station 20 feet away, felt the blood drain out of her face in a way she would later describe as physically painful, like something cold pouring through her chest. Frank Doyle's grip on Marcus's arm loosened, then dropped entirely, his own hands coming up in a small, useless gesture of apology that couldn't undo the last 4 minutes no matter how fast he moved them now. "Sir, we didn't know, nobody told us." Marcus straightened his jacket. He did not raise his voice. He would tell people later that this was the moment his mother's voice came back to him clearest, the memory of her hand on the back of his neck in that break room, steadying, not scolding, and he found, standing in that hallway with his heart still hammering, that he did not have room in his body for rage. He only had room for one thing. A little girl behind a door, running out of time. "Check her oxygen levels, now," he said to Priya, already moving past the guards toward room 214. "Everyone else, get out of my way." What happened in the next 6 minutes inside that room is the kind of thing hospitals write up afterward in careful, clinical language: respiratory distress secondary to post-operative complication, corrective intervention initiated within acceptable window, patient stabilized. What it actually looked like was a man who had just been physically restrained in a hallway outside his own patient's door, moving with perfect practice calm through an emergency that would have killed a 10-year-old girl within the hour if it had gone another 20 minutes undetected, adjusting her oxygen support, calling for a chest x-ray, catching, with his own hands, the exact complication his own monitoring system had flagged from 11 minutes in a shower and a half-eaten sandwich. Away. Sophie's mother, who had been asleep in a chair by the window, woke to the sound of urgent voices and found herself staring at the surgeon who had operated on her daughter that afternoon, his jacket still slightly rumpled from where 2 men had been holding his arms behind his back 10 minutes earlier, working with total focus over her little girl's bed. She would not learn what had just happened in the hallway until the next morning. When she did, she cried in the hospital cafeteria for 20 minutes, not from anger, though the anger would come later, but from a simple, overwhelming realization of how close her daughter had come to losing the one person capable of saving her. Over 4 minutes that never should have happened at all. By 3 o'clock that morning, Sophie Hastings was stable. Her oxygen levels had climbed back into a safe range. She would sleep through the rest of the night without knowing that a hallway 20 feet from her door had just become the site of the worst 4 minutes of her surgeon's career, and one of the most important 4 minutes of his life. Marcus Whitfield did not file a formal complaint that night. He didn't call the hospital's chief administrator, though the chief administrator would call him first thing the next morning, having already heard 3 different versions of the story before 7 a.m. He simply finished checking on Sophie, walked to the third-floor break room, sat down at the same plastic table where he had once done his homework as a boy while his mother ate her lunch at 3 in the morning, and stayed there until sunrise, alone, staring at a small brass plaque on the wall bearing his mother's name. Here is what almost nobody in that hospital knew about Marcus Whitfield, and it matters more than anything that happened in that hallway. He had been mistaken for someone he wasn't before. Not once, not twice, more times than he had ever bothered to count. Across 21 years in that building, across a childhood spent watching his mother clean floors that other people walked across without seeing her at all. He had been asked, in his own operating room, by a first-time patient's husband, if he could go get the real doctor. He had been stopped by hospital security once before, years earlier, as a resident, for the crime of using an elevator reserved for staff. He had learned, the way so many people who look like him learn, to carry his identification a certain way, to speak a certain way, to move through certain hallways with a kind of careful, practiced ease designed specifically to never give anyone a reason to look twice. And on the one night none of that armor was in place, the one night he was simply a father figure of a surgeon in a hurry to save a child's life, it had cost him exactly what he had spent his whole life trying to avoid it costing him. He thought about his mother's coffee can on top of the refrigerator. He thought about 11 years of overnight shifts nobody thanked her for. He thought about the word restricted and who that word tends to apply to and who it tends not to. By 8 a.m., the hospital's chief administrator, a careful, silver-haired man named Gerald Okafor who had worked with Marcus for 12 years, was standing in his office doorway, looking for the first time in the years Marcus had known him, genuinely shaken. "Marcus, I am so sorry. I don't have words for how sorry I am. The security footage is already being pulled. This is going to be handled, I promise you that." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want revenge, Gerald. I want you to understand what almost happened last night, and I don't mean to me. I mean to Sophie Hastings. For more minutes in that hallway. And this isn't a story about an apology. It's a story about a funeral. The internal review took 11 days. What it found was not a single moment of cruelty from any one person, but something the hospital's own investigators described uncomfortably as a systemic failure of assumption, an environment where new night shift staff had never once been shown a photograph of the hospital's own chief of surgery, where restricted wing protocols had no mechanism for verifying identity beyond visual judgment, where 3 separate people, in the span of 4 minutes, had each individually decided that the fastest explanation for an unfamiliar black man moving quickly through a hallway was threat rather than doctor, without a single one of them pausing long enough to consider the second possibility, let alone the third. Frank Doyle and Reggie Torres, the 2 security guards, were placed on leave pending review of their contracting firm's training protocols that it turned out had never once addressed hospital staff identification beyond a badge check that both men admitted, under review, they hadn't actually performed. The contracting firm itself lost its contract with Ridgeview Memorial within the month, not because 2 young guards had done something monstrous, but because an entire system had failed to teach them what to look for before teaching them how to restrain someone. And Kayla Simmons, the nurse who pressed the button, sat across from Gerald Okafor and the hospital's head of nursing 11 days later, fully expecting, by her own account later, to be walked out of the building with a box of her belongings before lunch. That is not what happened, and this is the part of the story that matters most, because it is the part that most stories like this one skip entirely in favor of a simpler kind of ending. Marcus Whitfield asked to be in that meeting. He asked to speak to her directly, alone, before any decision about her employment was made. Kayla walked and braced for the worst version of this conversation and got, instead, something she would later describe as far harder to sit with than anger would have been. "I'm not here to end your career," he told her. "I'm here to understand exactly what went through your mind in that hallway, because if I don't understand it and you don't understand it, this happens again to somebody else, And next time there might not be a doctor on and walking by with a printout in her hand at exactly the right moment. Kayla cried before she managed a single full sentence. I saw a man I didn't recognize moving fast at 2 in the morning in a restricted wing, and I didn't stop to think, I reacted. I know how that sounds. I know what it looks like. I keep asking myself if I would have called security that fast if you'd been wearing a white coat. I keep asking myself if I would have called security that fast if you'd looked like someone else. And I don't have an answer I can live with. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in 11 days, he finally told her. Most people who make the mistake you made spend the rest of their lives explaining why it wasn't really what it looked like. You didn't do that just now. That's worth something. He didn't ask for her to be fired. He asked, instead, for something the hospital's administration had never once implemented in its 40-year history: a mandatory orientation module for all clinical and security staff, featuring photographs and brief profiles of the hospital's full leadership team, doctors, department chiefs, senior surgeons, so that no employee in that building, on any shift at any hour, would ever again have to guess who belonged in a hallway based on nothing but a stranger's clothes and the color of his skin. He asked that it be named simply the Whitfield Protocol, not for himself, he was careful to clarify, but so that nobody in that building would ever forget why it existed. Kayla Simmons kept her job. She asked, 3 weeks later, to be personally involved in building the new orientation training, spending her own unpaid hours interviewing staff, reviewing old incident reports that had never been taken seriously before hers finally was, determined, in her words, to make sure her name was attached to something that fixed the problem instead of something that only apologized for it. 6 weeks after that night, Sophie Hastings, fully recovered, walked back into Ridgeview Memorial on her own 2 feet for a follow-up appointment, holding a homemade card in both hands, glitter glue still slightly tacky at the edges, that she had spent 3 afternoons making with her mother's help. She found Dr. Whitfield in the hallway outside his office, and without any hesitation at all, the kind only a 10-year-old can manage, she wrapped both arms around his waist and held on. "Are you the doctor who saved me twice?" she asked, looking up at him. Her mother had told her a simplified version of the story, careful with the details but honest about the shape of it, a mistake that almost cost her daughter everything, and a doctor who saved her anyway. Marcus knelt down to her eye level, the same way he would think later that his own mother used to kneel down to steady him when he was small. "I had some help," he told her. "But yes, I suppose I am." That afternoon, before Sophie and her mother left the hospital, they stopped by the 3rd floor, at Sophie's own quiet insistence, and stood in front of a small brass plaque outside a break room most patients never see, in memory of Odessa Whitfield, who kept this hospital running long before anyone thought to thank her. Sophie's mother read it twice, then looked at Marcus with an expression he would carry with him for a long time afterward, somewhere between grief and gratitude and a kind of fierce, quiet understanding. "She would be proud of you," she said. Marcus didn't trust himself to answer that one out loud. "I want to be honest with you about why this story stayed with me long after I first heard the shape of it, because it isn't really about a hallway, and it isn't really about a badge nobody checked. It's about how fast 4 minutes can turn into a funeral, and how many of those 4-minute windows happen every single day to people who never get a doctor on and walking by at exactly the right second with exactly the right printout in her hand. Most of the time, there's no dramatic reveal. There's no chief of surgery underneath the misunderstanding. There's just a person treated as a threat before they were ever treated as a human being, and a system that quietly decides that's an acceptable cost of doing business." Marcus Whitfield didn't ask the world to feel sorry for him. He asked one hospital to look a little harder, a little sooner, at the difference between fear and fact. And a 26-year-old nurse, given the chance to disappear quietly into her own shame, chose instead to spend her nights off rebuilding the very system that had failed both of them. Because the hardest, most honest thing a person can do after getting it wrong is stay in the room long enough to help make it right. So here's what I'll leave you with. Somewhere tonight, in a hallway you'll never see, someone is being sized up in half a second by a stranger who doesn't yet know a single true thing about them. Most of the time, Nobody will ever find out how wrong that half second was. That's not a comfortable thought, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But if there's a lesson worth carrying out of this one, it's not about waiting to be proven important enough to deserve a second look. It's about giving that second look to everyone long before you ever find out who they turn out to be. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments, has someone ever misjudged you before they knew a single true thing about you? And if you've ever carried a weight like Marcus carried his mother's memory through that hallway, quietly for years, without asking anyone to notice, share this with someone who needs to hear that the weight they're carrying counts for something. I'll see you in the next one.